Welcome to the Parenting Power Podcast, supporting parents with the real-life tools they need to raise the confident, interdependent people the world needs. Gail Bell and Julie Friedman-Smith interview experts who share their knowledge to assist parents in creating a home environment where kids can thrive.
Hello, this is Julie Friedman-Smith.
And I'm Gail Bell.
It's great to have you with us so that we have a chance to share ideas of experts that are making a difference for parents. Over the past year or so, Gail and I have been involved with the Palix Foundation and the Alberta Health and Wellness Initiative, and we wanted to share more of that information with you. Today, we are lucky to have Dr. Nicole Sherren with us. Nicole is the Scientific Director and Senior Program Officer with the Palix Foundation. Nicole has a PhD in neuroscience from Carleton University and moved to Alberta in 2003 to hold an Alberta Heritage Foundation for Medical Research and Neuroscience Canada Research Fellowship at the University of Lethbridge. Her research focuses include experience-based brain development, neurodevelopmental disorders, and brain plasticity. Nicole joined the Palix Foundation in 2007 to focus on mobilizing the science of early brain development into policy and professional practice. And one of the things Nicole does so well is take all of this intricate and complex neuroscience and put it into language that we can all understand. So we are excited to have you here today, Nicole. Thank you so much for joining us.
Oh, it's my pleasure, Julie and Gail. I'm really happy to be here this morning and have this conversation with you.
Nicole, we know that in the past, the whole nature versus nurture debate has been quite strong. What is the research showing us about experiences affecting our biology?
We now know that we can no longer think about nature and nurture as being separate entities. Our experiences actually have a profound impact on our biology, and they shape that biology over time in ways that can set us up to either potentially have good outcomes or potentially set us up to do more poorly over the course of our lives. So we now think about this developmental period as being a key period where those experiences are getting biologically embedded in our brains primarily, but also in our bodies. So if you want to think about a really common experience that everyone can relate to in terms of how that might affect circuits of the brain, think about a young child learning how to speak. When we're first born, we are able to discriminate phonemes from any language around the world. But over the course of that first year of life, as the experience of hearing language being spoken around us, and primarily one language, our mother tongue, that helps shape the developing language circuits in a child's brain. We become very, very, very good and very efficient at discriminating phonemes from the language that we hear the most often. And we gradually lose the ability to discriminate phonemes from other languages. That's why, as adults, often when we hear other languages being spoken, it's really hard to tell what the individual words are. And that's because our language circuits have been shaped through experience in those first few years of life. So certainly in terms of language circuits, but language circuits develop in the same way that all the other circuits of the brain also develop. They develop over the course of that developmental period through the experiences that we have. And what happens is our neural circuits start to wire up over time. Cells start to reach out and make connections with other cells around them in order to support the ability to have certain skills and certain behaviors. But the experiences that we have over time work key connections within that circuit, and they work them very, very strongly. Those connections get really strong and stable and solidify and remain over the lifespan of that circuit. The connections that don't get used very much gradually weaken and they get pruned away. This is a normal developmental process, by the way. It's the way in which our brain creates speed and efficiency in terms of processing information. So it's the experiences that we're having that are really sculpting those neural circuits over time through what we call a use it or lose it kind of process.
And you've been mentioning the developmental period, and just to be clear here, that's pretty young in a child's overall development. Am I right about that?
Well, actually, it turns out that the brain doesn't finish maturing until we're in our mid to our late 20s. So while that early developmental period, maybe before the age of 5 or 6 years old, is a really, really important period in terms of setting up some really basic neural circuits that are going to support, the development of more complex behaviors over time, this sort of experience-based development process occurs throughout the time that the brain is maturing. What happens is that more basic circuits develop first, and they become the solid foundation on which more complex circuits are going to emerge. So, for example, if you think about the motor system, when babies are born, they're able to move around, but they're not actually able to coordinate the movements of their limbs very easily. They learn that over time. Eventually, they learn to sit up, and they learn to crawl, and then to stand, and then eventually to walk. And as we get older, we can develop more complex motor pathways as well, while we learn to play a particular sport or even a musical instrument. But those skills, while they are foundational, are not the only skills that are developing throughout our lives. The executive function system, which is one of the highest order cognitive systems that we have, starts coming online fairly early in life, but continues to develop into our mid to our late 20s. It is the last area of the brain, that prefrontal cortex area, which supports our executive functions. It's the last area of the brain to mature. And so it's continuing to mature through adolescence and through early adulthood. So all of the experiences that we're having throughout that period of our lives are shaping neural circuits over time.
Wonderful. Thank you. Can you tell us more about some of the key experiences which are important for a child's development?
Sure. I've mentioned a lot of experiences so far, things like language and learning a musical instrument or a sport. But those are not really the most important experiences that we need to have during the developmental period. The most important experiences are actually social. And I want people to think sort of very broadly about what a social experience is. A social experience that would be critical to the developing brain would look like a serve and return that goes on between two people playing a game like tennis. But in this case, it would be a child and a responsive adult. The child serves up some kind of interaction, some kind of communication. The adult needs to recognize that and return the serve in a developmentally appropriate way, and in a way that keeps that activity going back and forth for a period of time. What this is doing is helping that child practice really, really basic skills that are going to be strengthening key neural circuits in their brain. So think about that experience that I talked to you about learning your mother tongue, learning how to speak when you're in your first and second year of life. Mm-hmm. That is also a social interaction. So if we think about babies, when they're born, they're able to make sounds, they start to be able to babble, and what do? We babble back in a way that gets them babbling even more. We exchange that serve and return interaction. So even though it's an interaction where we're practicing language skills, it's also a social interaction. The child needs the adult there to help them practice that babbling ability. And as they get to be more sophisticated in terms of the sounds they're able to make, we get more sophisticated in terms of the sounds that we make. We start to actually use words and help children practice saying really, really basic words like mama and dada, those sorts of things. And so the child continues to go back and forth and practice all of those sounds, and that's shaping language circuits in their brain. So we know that these social interactions are really, really critical to development. And again, thinking about them broadly, you could think about a social interaction as being either a babbling back and forth. It could be something like playing peekaboo with a young child. It could look like singing a song or even reading to a child. All of those things are social interactions where the child and the adult are exchanging different types of activities, different types of communication, and that's supporting skill development for the child. Even think about social interaction as being along the lines of helping your child calm down when they're frightened by something. That's a social interaction. The child serves up what's going on. Oh, they're frightened. They're getting upset. And the adult needs to respond in a developmentally appropriate way by perhaps picking the child up, soothing them in some way. That adult is helping that child practice emotional control. They're helping that child practice coping with threatening or scary situations. Even something along the lines of helping your child interact with their peers. They need to learn to get along with other people who they encounter, and that adult can help them when they're interacting with their peers think about how to, for example, share a toy. That's hard for kids to do when they're really little. They don't think about sharing toys. They want to have that toy all to themselves. But in order to be able to get along with others, we need to learn how to share what we're doing and interact with them appropriately. And so that adult coming in and supporting the child in all of those activities are those serve and return style social interactions. And as we get even older, certainly those serve and return interactions continue to be critical. They could look like helping your tween plan out what they're going to take in terms of high school courses to meet their goal of going to a university. It could look like supporting your teenager through the first time that they get dumped in a romantic relationship. That can be quite stressful and upsetting for somebody who is going through that. And so having that adult support helps them learn how to cope with those challenges. And these are similar challenges, by the way, to what they're going to face later on in development. So those interactions with responsive and supportive adults are really, really critical because they are providing that platform for practice, which provides the skill building and the building of neural circuits in the brain.
Wow, Nicole, you've given us so many great examples that as parents we can all relate to, and stressing the important role of parents supporting children through all these different ages and stages, including some stressful events in our lives because we all have them. Can you tell us a little bit more about the effects of stress on children's lives?
One thing I do want to say first, though, is that it is important for children to experience some challenge while they're developing. There are many different types of stress that we now think about in terms of how they shape the architecture of the developing brain. And a really critical one is what we think of as positive stress. So this is a brief activation of the stress response system, releases stress hormones into the body that prepares us for some sort of reaction, a fight or flight reaction. But stress hormones come back down to baseline reasonably quickly. And what this type of positive stress does is it gives kids small challenges with which they can practice their stress coping skills. Stress coping skills develop just like any other kind of skill that we have, and they're governed by key neural circuits in the brain. So those neural circuits need to be essentially exercised on a regular basis to ensure that our coping mechanisms are developing apace and getting nice and strong and sturdy and will help us cope with the challenges that we know we're going to face throughout our lives. So it is important for kids to experience some stress. We think about things like the first time that you go to the doctor's office or the dentist's office, the first day of school or the first day of a new school year, or even, maybe the first time you're separated from a caregiver as being a positive stress. And, I can actually remember the first time my parents went out on a date night and left my sister and I with a babysitter. They didn't have a lot of money when we were growing up, and so they didn't go out very often. So I do actually recall the first time that they went out. And it was upsetting for me. As a child, I remember throwing a bit of a tantrum. But that tantrum didn't last very long. The babysitter was there and able to help me get control of my emotions. And after that, we had a pretty good time. So that would be an example of a positive stress. The next kind of stress that's important in terms of our developmental experience is what we call tolerable stress. This is a more serious activation of the stress response system. But the key defining factor in tolerable stress is that the child has access to a caring, supportive adult who can help them buffer their response to the stress. Essentially what this adult is doing is they're acting like an external stress response system for the child. So the child is getting very upset. The adult is able to come in, and again, this is another one of those serve and return style interactions. The adult is able to come in, help that child calm down, soothe their fears, and help them practice their coping mechanisms. Maybe even teach them more sophisticated coping mechanisms if they're ready for it. So in that way, tolerable stress, even though it is a more serious stressor than what we would think of as a positive stress, doesn't leave a lasting footprint on our biology. The kind of stress that we need to worry about, though, in terms of its effect on children and their outcomes is called toxic stress. So toxic stress is a severe and prolonged activation of our stress response system. Stress hormones are released into the body and they remain high for long periods of time. And the key here is in the absence of adequate adult support. So the child does not have enough adult support to buffer their response to that stress. No one's there to help them calm down. No one is there to help them practice their coping strategies. And so what toxic stress does is, again, it releases large amounts of stress hormones into the body. Stress hormones can damage numerous systems if they remain high over long periods of time. They can potentially damage our cardiovascular system, our metabolic system, our immune system. All of these systems get jacked up with all of that toxic stress, and they run at very, very high levels, which they're not designed to do. It produces wear and tear on those systems over time, and in that way, it can actually make us vulnerable to many common diseases and disorders later on in life. It can make us vulnerable to things like heart disease, strokes, metabolic diseases, inflammatory diseases. All of those things are exacerbated by constant toxic stress. But toxic stress also gets embedded in our brains as well. It affects the stress response circuit, and it damages that circuit over time. It makes it harder and harder for us to control our response to stress. It also affects our executive function circuit. And keep in mind that that circuit is developing essentially throughout that entire period of brain maturation. So right from the time that we're born all the way through to our mid to our late 20s. And that toxic stress is also affecting our ability to control our emotions, to make good decisions, to problem solve. If you think about what happens when you're under a lot of stress for long periods of time, do you ever find that you get a little bit absent-minded, maybe a little bit irritable, maybe a little bit less able to see creative solutions to the problems that you're facing? That's the effect of stress hormones on your prefrontal cortex. But when those stress hormones are being released while that circuit is developing, it can actually take that development offline. It can affect how that circuit forms, which of the connections get nice and strong and stable, and which of those connections get pruned away. So in that respect, toxic stress can have a pretty profound influence both on our brains and on our peripheral systems, and it can leave us vulnerable to many, many different types of illnesses and social problems over time.
Wow. You've really stated that so clearly, and we appreciate those three different ideas of stress that the Palix Foundation and the Alberta Health and Wellness Initiative have really clarified, because parents sometimes want to protect their kids from having any stress, and I think that you've really articulated that hardship is part of the building blocks of life, and they're going to happen to all of us, and so really our kids need the opportunity to experience those small pieces of stress, and in fact it can be beneficial in helping them learn how to manage the stresses that they will encounter, and also the ones that are just really, really detrimental. I know, Nicole, we could probably speak to you for hours about this, but if our listeners want to get more information from you and from the Foundation, what's the best place for them to follow you?
Go to our Alberta Family Wellness Initiative website. We have a whole host of free resources on that website that are available for people. We have short video vignettes that explain some of the concepts that we've touched on today for a general audience. We have a lot of different resources that are specific to particular groups that can be accessed off of that. So if people are from key professional backgrounds, they might be interested in some of our resources that are targeted more towards professionals. But we also now have a free online course. It's roughly 30 hours in length, but it goes through this experience-based brain development journey, taking people who want a deeper dive much more into the research behind experience-based brain development, but also into some of the clinical implications for that and some of the implications for our systems. It's a great course. I'd highly recommend it to anyone who wants to do a deeper dive in that area. So one other thing that I want to emphasize, though, is that even though we think about parents as being key providers of those serve and return social interactions for kids, any responsive adult can provide those serve and return social interactions as well. Children don't grow up just within the confines of their family. They grow up within this dense network, this web of relationships. And so while, yes, parents are often the key point people in terms of supporting their kids in terms of this early learning, there are a whole host of other people who can be providing those essential serve and return interactions as well. Think about the child care providers that you might use, or the teachers in your child's school, even any other adult who they meet throughout the course of their day-to-day, a coach that they might have as a key mentor, or a music teacher. All of these people can help support kids through that developmental period by being that safe, stable, responsive adult.
That is so amazing to hear, because sometimes it feels like, as one person, really, what can I do? What I hear you saying is
right.
Each of us has the opportunity to affect change on, even if it's just one other person in the world. If we see a child who is struggling, that we can step in, not and take over their lives, but just be there as someone who can walk along that path with them and perhaps change the course of their life.
Absolutely. And you know what, Julie, I think you've hit on something really important there, and that is about how we as a community help support all children to build those foundations of resilience. And we think about resilience now as being not just an outcome, but also a process of skill building. So in order to be able to have positive outcomes in the face of challenges, what do we need? We need those supportive serve and return interactions that help us build pro-social skills. Skills like good emotional control, skills like problem solving, being able to make critical judgments, being able to cope with challenges. Those are really, really key skills that are going to help us have good outcomes even when we face challenges later on in life. But we also need to think about buffering the stress that kids experience in their life. If it's tolerable stress or toxic stress, we know that any adult can step in and help that child cope with a challenge that would be overwhelming if they didn't have enough adult support. So that's how we think about resilience building now, and it really does take all of us collectively to come together and think about how we support kids in terms of building those key skills.
Well, that's great. Thank you, Nicole. There's so much information. Julie and I have both taken the BRAIN course and gathered so much valuable information for us. But also, as you suggested, those small videos are incredible, and we encourage people to go and check that out. Thank you so much for sharing all this information with us.
You're welcome. It was my pleasure.
To learn more about Parenting Power, check out our website, parentingpower.ca, visit our Facebook page, or follow us on Instagram and Twitter @Parenting Power.